Hi, my name's Lana. I was diagnosed with cancer, and while I was preparing for the fight of my life, my husband was planning a future with someone else. I found hotel receipts, a secret prenup with his mistress, and then I discovered he'd already started moving money behind my back. So I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I transferred everything, my trust, my estate, my name, away from him. But what hurts more than the betrayal is realizing everyone else knew, and no one told me. How do you stay standing when the people closest to you are quietly rooting for you to disappear? There's a strange kind of silence in the room when your life gets divided into before and after. The doctor's words were kind, too kind. That careful tone they use when the truth can't be softened anymore. Stage 4, ovarian, the kind that doesn't negotiate. I nodded. I didn't ask questions. I didn't cry. I think he expected me to cry. Driving back home through snow-dusted streets, I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Vermont looked like it always did this time of year. Gray skies, the occasional salt truck rumbling by. But inside me, something had shifted. Something quiet but irreversible. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had already made the first decision. I wasn't going to tell anyone. Not yet. Inside the house, I peeled off my gloves, placed the envelope with my diagnosis on the kitchen table, then moved it. I didn't want it out. I didn't want it to exist. I slipped it into the drawer in my desk upstairs, locked it, and dropped the key into my jewelry box. Out of sight. I didn't eat that night. I warmed a bowl of soup just to move it around with a spoon. Drayton texted me, "Running late, don't wait up." Typical. His workdays had been stretching for months. Longer hours, later nights, less explanation. I used to ask. Now I didn't see the point. He came home at 9:15, didn't notice the untouched soup, didn't ask how my day was. He walked in talking about a client's renovation budget and whether we'd need to refinance one of the properties. While he poured himself a drink, his phone buzzed on the counter. I only looked because the screen lit up. The name read, Arlena. Just that. No last name. He flipped the phone over so fast, you'd think it was on fire. I didn't say anything. In sickness and in health, they say. But I was starting to learn that illness doesn't always bring people closer. Sometimes it just pulls back the curtain on what was always missing. We went to bed like strangers sharing the same rented space. He lay there scrolling, back turned. I stared at the ceiling, counting the soft clicks of the fan. I remembered the day we moved into this house, 12 years ago. Early spring. We had planted roses in the front yard. I remember digging my hands into the dirt, laughing when I found an old horseshoe buried deep. It was supposed to mean luck. Now the roses were gone, dug up and replaced with landscape gravel last year. Drayton said it was more modern, just like everything else. Updated, efficient, easier to manage. At some point during the night, I reached out under the covers. Not for him, just for something warm. But there was nothing. Just the edge of the bed and the cold. The next morning, I watched him from the front window. He was standing by his car, phone in hand again, thumbs moving quickly. Then he smiled. A real smile. The kind I hadn't seen in months. And that's when I realized. He wasn't smiling at me. The moment passed, but it stuck to me like residue. That smile. It lingered even after Drayton drove off, his taillights swallowed by the street. I stood there longer than I needed to, the coffee in my hand gone cold. There was a time when I could tell who he was talking to just by the way his shoulders relaxed. This wasn't one of those times. And that wasn't my smile. Later that afternoon, after cleaning up breakfast and folding a load of towels, I sat at my desk to sort through bills. The usual: utilities, mortgage, insurance. One email caught my eye. It was from the credit card company. I almost deleted it. We rarely use that account anymore. But something told me to click. There it was. In black and white. The White Birch Inn, Burlington. 2 nights. King Suite. Champagne and spa package. Reservation under Drayton Cole. Below it, A name. Arlena Voss. I didn't move, just stared. There were no explanations this time. No justifiable business expense. No out-of-town client. No conference call to excuse away 2 nights of luxury. I forwarded the receipt to myself. Then again. Then I saved it under a new folder I had just created. Fireproof. No yelling, no confrontation. I didn't need either. What I needed now was information and distance. By Friday morning, I was sitting across from Alan, our old family attorney. He greeted me with a hesitant smile. We hadn't spoken in years. I slid a folder across the desk and waited as he flipped through the marriage agreement we had signed over a decade ago. He paused, eyes narrowing, then looked at me. You signed over full power of attorney 10 years ago, during your hysterectomy. I remembered that surgery. The pain, the fog. And Drayton, standing beside my hospital bed, asking me to sign a couple of papers so he could handle things while I recovered. Just sign it, sweetheart. You don't need to worry about this stuff. Alan shook his head. You basically handed him full control. He can liquidate, transfer, restructure, without notifying you. I sat back, not in shock, but in recognition. He hadn't started preparing for my absence when the cancer came. He had started years before, when I was too weak to read the fine print. And I let him. That afternoon, I drove home with the windows down, even though the air was still crisp. I needed something real to cut through the feeling that I'd been living a script someone else wrote for me. When I pulled into the driveway, Drayton's car wasn't there. It rarely was these days. I stepped inside and headed straight to the kitchen, washed my hands, and began pulling out ingredients for dinner. I wasn't sure why I still cooked. Maybe it was habit. Or maybe I wanted to be the one to decide when that habit would end. I put on the earrings he bought me for our 10th anniversary. Gold with small diamonds. Expensive, but impersonal. I used to think they were romantic. Now I realized they were just quiet hush money. A glittering way to say, stay in your lane. Drayton arrived halfway through the meal. He didn't apologize for being late. He never did anymore. He said something about traffic and a call running long. I nodded. I asked how the client responded to the pitch. He made up a name. I didn't correct him. While we ate, he scrolled through his phone between bites. I could see his reflection in the wine glass. How he'd smirk when a text came in. How quickly he swiped it away. I watched in silence. Not because I was afraid, but because I had already started preparing my answer. After dinner, while he showered upstairs, I went to the office. I printed out the hotel receipt. Then I folded it neatly, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it. Not with tape, but with the wax kit I kept from when I used to write letters to my mother. I pressed the red wax firmly, the stamp leaving a clean impression. I didn't write a name on the front. I didn't need to. I placed the envelope in the back of the desk drawer, behind a stack of tax records. Not for revenge, not even for confrontation, just for when the time came. By Sunday morning, the envelope was still in the drawer, untouched. I hadn't told a soul, not Merrick, not Sorrel, not even Gilda, who somehow always managed to find out everything before anyone else. But something about the way Drayton left for a meeting that morning, wearing the shirt he only ironed for very specific occasions, made me pause. There was a rhythm to his deceit now, well-practiced, smooth. He'd become efficient at it. Quiet cheating, like a silent drip from a faucet you've learned to tune out. I was standing in the kitchen, finishing a second cup of coffee, when the front door opened. "Surprise!" Sorrel called out as she stepped inside, her toddler balanced on one hip and a diaper bag slung over her shoulder. I hadn't seen her in 2 weeks. She walked in like everything was normal, and maybe for her, it was. Drayton appeared from upstairs like he'd just come home from war, wide smile, arms open. "Look who's here!" he beamed, already reaching for his granddaughter. He kissed Sorrel on the cheek like the doting father of a Hallmark ad. "Did you bring the pastries?" she asked, dropping her bag on the floor. He nodded. Of course. I stopped by Main Street Bakery this morning. They both sat down like it was Sunday brunch. I stayed standing. Sorrel gave me a side glance and half a smile. You know, sometimes I think Dad's more emotionally available than you ever were. I blinked. I hadn't expected a dagger before breakfast. There it was. Casual, sharp, and likely meant as a joke. But it sliced anyway. I poured more coffee. Would you like a cup? I asked, careful not to let my hand tremble as I set it down in front of her. She didn't notice. She was too busy watching Drayton pretend to be the version of himself he thought people wanted. I didn't respond. Not to her comment. Not to the way he handed over the child like he was the one who changed her diapers. I knew the truth. He hadn't been around for most of the hard parts. But you don't get awards for endurance in motherhood. You just carry the weight and get mistaken for cold when you don't collapse under it. Later that day, after a mostly silent lunch and half-watched cartoons playing in the background, Sorrel lay down with her daughter in the guest room. Drayton went into his office with a phone call and shut the door behind him. I stood in the hallway, watching the baby monitor, listening to the soft hum of the white noise machine. And I thought about the years when I woke up at 4 a.m. to pack Sorrel's lunches, work the early shift at the bookstore, and then take on side clients just to make sure her birthday parties didn't feel like afterthoughts. No one ever clapped for those things. No one ever will. They remember the play you missed, not the fact that you still sewed her costume at midnight. They remember you not hugging enough, not the nights you stayed awake, checking her temperature every hour when she had a fever. They remember your silence, not the reason behind it. When Sorrel woke and gathered her things, I helped her load the car. She didn't bring up the comment from earlier, and I didn't offer a reminder. Before she got in, I said quietly, I hope one day you'll see the things I never had time to say out loud. She looked at me, just for a second. Her expression flickered, but she nodded. The toddler, grinning, reached up and handed me a drawing. 3 stick figures, scribbled in crayon. That's you, she pointed. That's Mommy, and that's the happy man. Behind her, Drayton chuckled. I must have made an impression. I smiled for the child's sake. My hands trembled as I folded the picture and tucked it into my coat pocket. When the car pulled away, I watched it disappear around the curve of our road. The same road I used to drive every morning to take Sorrel to school, even in snowstorms, even when I hadn't slept. I went inside, walked up the stairs slowly, passed by Drayton's office door, still closed, still on a call. In my bedroom, I stood in front of the mirror. No makeup today, just my own face, my own eyes, a little more tired than I remembered. I touched my hair. It was getting thinner. The treatments were doing their work. But so was I. I opened the drawer again, pulled out a new folder I had labeled just a few days ago. Contingency, Phase 2. This time, it wasn't for secrets. It was for protection. And I whispered, not to anyone, just to the room. If they won't see what was done, then I'll show them what's missing. The folder sat on my nightstand the entire night. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. Its contents weren't just paper. They were proof. Not just of betrayal, but of preparation. Quiet moves made behind my back while I cooked dinner and folded his clothes. You can't mourn something you already buried in your mind. By early morning, the sky was steel gray, and the cold hung low in the air. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I took my laptop, the hard drive, and nothing else. I didn't even pack a change of clothes. Driving up to the cabin was muscle memory. Every curve of the mountain road, every rusted fence post along the way felt familiar, though I hadn't been up there since Christmas. Not this past one, last year's. The one where we all cut down the tree together and pretended things were still whole. Before I got tired of pretending, when I stepped inside, it was like opening a time capsule. The faint scent of lavender still lingered from the oil diffuser I'd left on the table. Blankets were still folded across the armchairs. One of Merrick's old board games sat beneath the coffee table, its lid slightly askew. Nothing had moved, and yet the room didn't feel the same. I didn't sit down. I went straight to the wall cabinet, opened the small compartment behind the spice rack, and pulled out the old backup drive. It was dusty. The label had peeled halfway off, but it was intact. The camera system we'd installed years ago had been left running, storing everything onto this drive. A habit of mine Drayton never bothered to understand. "You and your camera obsession," he used to mutter. "You'd archive air if you could." I plugged it into the laptop and waited for it to boot. The screen flickered, then loaded a dated folder system. I scanned the thumbnails, grainy stills marked with timestamps. 3 weeks ago, on a Thursday, the file size spiked. Motion. Activity. I clicked. The cabin's front room appeared on the screen. Then Drayton walked in, laughing. Behind him was Arlena, her scarf unwrapped, her hand still resting on his shoulder. He poured them wine, the same bottle we'd been saving for our 20th anniversary. She kicked off her boots like she'd done it before. He said something I couldn't hear. She laughed, like she belonged there, like it was hers. Then the bedroom. The coat she wore fell across the arm of the couch. He disappeared into the hallway. She followed. But before he turned the corner, he looked toward the camera. Just for a second. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. And then he turned away, like it didn't matter. That was the part that hurt more than anything. Not the kissing, not the way he held her waist, not even the wine. It was the knowing. He knew it was my space, my place of peace, and he desecrated it anyway. I closed the laptop without watching more. My hands were trembling, but my breath was steady. I sat at the kitchen table where we used to eat pancakes as a family, where Sorrel once threw a tantrum over blueberries, and where Merrick carved his name into the edge of the wood when he was 9. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just stared out the window at the frost layering the ground and began writing a list in my notebook. Final separation actions, private and legal. It was methodical: asset freeze, trust reassignment, healthcare directives, property hold. My handwriting didn't shake. My lines were straight, neat. I added deadlines beside each bullet point. No emotion, just execution. Later, I stepped outside. The sun had barely broken through, but I needed the fresh air. The wind bit into my cheeks as I stood on the porch. I stared at the line of pines that edged the field. They'd always stood tall, season after season, no matter what was planted or harvested. Maybe that's what resilience really looked like. Not fighting, just standing. I sealed the hard drive in a fireproof bag and slipped a sticky note onto the front. "If I go first, deliver to Merrick. He'll know what to do." Back inside, I tucked it behind the pantry shelf, between the backup generator manual and an old copy of our mortgage papers. Then I put on my boots and walked into the backyard. The ground was stiff, but not frozen. I stepped down slowly, pressing my heels into the dirt, grounding myself. They took my name out of their stories. So now I write the ending. When I got back to the house that evening, the front porch light was still on. It flickered faintly, like it hadn't been changed in years. I unlocked the door, stepped into the silence, and kicked off my boots. The fireplace was glowing low in the living room. Drayton wasn't home. At least not yet. I took a long shower, braided my hair back like I used to in college, and slipped into a sweatshirt that had holes along the sleeves. It wasn't meant to be nostalgic. It just felt like armor. Around 7:45, I heard the knock. 3 soft taps, the kind that didn't belong to anyone from this house. Not Merrick, not Sorrel. When I opened the door, Arlena Voss stood there, hair damp from drizzle, lips chapped, eyeliner trailing down one cheek. She wore a thin trench coat, too short for April in Vermont. Her eyes searched my face like she expected me to slap her, or save her. "I didn't know," she started. "I swear. I thought you two were separated." I didn't say a word. Not because I couldn't, but because I wanted her to fill the silence herself. "He told me you were just roommates, that you hadn't been close in years, that you were sick and needed space." I leaned my shoulder against the doorframe. Her voice shook. "He made it sound like you'd already left him, emotionally. that you were cold, that you didn't notice things anymore." That part almost made me laugh. I looked her dead in the eyes. "You didn't knock for me, you knocked for yourself. And now you'll leave for the same reason." I closed the door, not hard, not loud, just enough to make it final. I turned off the porch light on my way back in. Around 9 Merrick got home from work. He took off his coat, dropped his keys in the tray by the door, and walked straight to the kitchen where I was slicing apples for tea. "You okay?" he asked. I didn't answer right away, just handed him a cup. We sat across from each other in the dim light of the kitchen. No music, just the occasional creak of the old floorboards. "You know why Dad never bonded with me, right?" he asked, setting his mug down. I looked at him, not puzzled, just waiting. "Because I see things," he said. "Like you do. Because I don't flatter him. Because I ask questions he doesn't want to answer. And I don't shrink when he raises his voice." He drummed his fingers once against the table. "I'm not sorry I turned out like you," he added, "and I think he is." It hit deeper than I expected. Not as an insult, but as clarity. Recognition wrapped in grit. I reached over and placed my hand gently over his. "Then I guess we're both still standing." He smiled, tired but proud. "That makes two of us." After he went upstairs, I lingered in the kitchen a little longer. When the clock hit midnight, I walked to my desk and opened the folder I'd labeled active. I wrote a letter. Not a dramatic one. Just direct. To my attorney, please proceed with the trust revision and property reassignment. Freeze all accounts under joint authorization. Include Merrick as alternate medical POA. Include backup guardianship for minor grandchild. Final line. If he pushes again, I will no longer just withdraw. I will dismantle. I sealed the envelope and slid it into the folder. Then I sat at my vanity and removed the earrings I'd worn earlier. The ones he gave me on our 15th anniversary. I laid them flat beside the glass tray. No sentiment attached. As I looked in the mirror, I whispered, not to my reflection, but to the space he used to occupy in my life. "I'm not the one who disappeared. You are." At 6 a.m., the growl of tires on gravel snapped me out of a shallow sleep. I moved to the front window. Drayton's car pulled into the driveway, but he wasn't alone. In the passenger seat sat a woman who didn't flinch when the engine stopped. She knew exactly where she was. She didn't ask for directions. She didn't hesitate. She adjusted her coat, checked her lipstick in the mirror, and reached for the handle. He heard the warning, and he came to test it. She stepped out of the car before he even turned off the ignition. That woman. The same one I'd seen wrapped around him in still frames, in a cabin that used to belong to me more than it ever did to him. She walked up the driveway like she'd memorized the cracks in the pavement, like she expected her key to still work. But I didn't open the door. I let them stand outside just long enough for her to start glancing back at the car. Then I opened it with all the calm I could find. Not a welcome, just an open door. Drayton walked in first, breezing past me like this was still his domain. His coat landed on the same hook it always had. He poured himself coffee like routine could erase history. I followed him into the kitchen without saying a word. The other woman? She lingered by the entryway, unsure whether she belonged. She didn't. He turned toward me, mug in hand, and said, "We should probably talk. There's been a lot of confusion lately." I nodded. "Yes. Let me show you what clarity looks like." We moved to the dining room. He sat in his old seat at the head of the table. I stayed standing. Then I placed the black folder in front of him and flipped it open. Inside was everything. Still images from the cabin camera, labeled by date and time. Receipts from the joint account he thought I never checked. Emails forwarded from the hotel's reservation system. The power of attorney he had manipulated 10 years ago when I was groggy from anesthesia. And most importantly, a notarized document showing the trust was no longer within his reach. I watched his face, the way it twitched, not in shock, but in irritation. The game had shifted, and he wasn't the one holding the rules anymore. "You thought I'd die quietly," I said, my voice even. "I decided to live loudly, on paper." He flipped through the papers, one by one. When he reached the notarized page, he exhaled sharply. "You really think this'll hold up in court?" I leaned slightly forward, my hands on the back of the chair across from him. "It's not court I'm worried about, it's your reputation." For the first time in a long time, he blinked and didn't have a comeback. I took that silence and left the room. An hour later, I stood in the backyard with Merrick and Sorrel. The morning sun had burned off the frost, and the grass felt soft beneath my shoes. I handed them each a sealed envelope. Merrick's was heavier, documents transferring legal control of the trust to him. Sorrel's held updated healthcare directives and letters I'd written in the middle of the night, when I couldn't sleep and didn't want to be angry. "If something happens to me," I told them, "don't go to your father, you go here." I handed them a card with Alan's number, my attorney. Merrick stared at the envelope, then at me. "You're serious?" "As a second will." Sorrel shifted uncomfortably. Are we at that point?" "We passed that point months ago," I said. "He didn't just cheat on me. He tried to erase me. I've redrawn the map." Neither of them argued. By nightfall, I was back inside, curled up by the fireplace with my laptop. The flames cracked softly beside me. I clicked into my email to forward some files to Alan and found a new message. Subject: Inquiry regarding inheritance assets from legaloccole-and-partnerslaw.com. The body of the email was short. Too short. "Consider this your final opportunity to settle amicably before we take further action." I closed the laptop. I didn't frown. I didn't feel the panic they wanted me to feel. I stood and walked toward the fireplace, letting the heat press gently against my legs. I looked into the flames like they were speaking a language only I could understand. "I already settled," I whispered. "What's left is just ash." The next morning, I sat across from Alan in his office, the windows streaked with spring rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to fall or hover. He handed me a folder, with a look I'd only seen once before, from a nurse who handed me the results without a word, just a hand on my shoulder. "This came in yesterday," he said. "It was filed 2 days ago, quietly. You weren't meant to see it yet." The envelope was cream-colored. Elegant. I didn't even have to open it to know it reeked of entitlement. Inside, a prenuptial agreement, filed under Drayton's name. Named party, Arlena Voss, filed 3 weeks ago. Same week I was at the infusion center, watching the IV drip and wondering if my fingernails would fall off this time. No anger, no gasp, just something low and final settling into my chest, like wet cement poured over a crack that was already there. "He wasn't just planning to leave me," I murmured. "He was rehearsing it while I was still here." Alan didn't answer. There was nothing to say. By the time I left the office, the rain had stopped, but left a chill that followed me all the way home. I parked in the driveway and stayed inside the car a while, the prenup resting on the passenger seat like a ghost. I stared at it, then at my hands on the wheel. They didn't shake anymore. The next evening was Merrick's birthday. We kept it simple, just family, a few friends. Sorrel came early and helped me set the table. Gilda brought her famous peach cobbler and 2 bottles of red wine. Drayton didn't show up. He sent flowers, no card, which meant someone else had ordered them. The dinner moved along like a river that pretended not to be dragging you toward a waterfall. Laughter in pockets, forks scraping plates, birthday candles flickering near the window. And then Gilda, somewhere between stories and sips of wine, let it slip. "You know," she laughed, swirling her glass, "Drayton told me months ago he wasn't planning to stay. Said he already had plans with Arlena." "Oh." Her voice cracked right there. Too late. The room froze. Merrick's fork stopped midair, his face unreadable. Sorrel set down her glass so slowly you could hear the slight tap on the table. Gilda's eyes widened. Her hand covered her mouth. "I didn't mean..." I thought. I stood, picked up the stack of empty plates, and without looking at anyone, said, "Well, that's one mystery solved." No one followed me into the kitchen. That night, around 10, Sorrel knocked on my bedroom door. She stepped in before I answered, her arms crossed like she wasn't sure what to do with them. "You knew?" she said. "You knew all of this and didn't tell us." I folded a sweater and placed it in the drawer before I responded. "Because I wanted you to love him for who you thought he was," I said, "not for who I knew he'd become." She stared at me, quiet. Her expression was somewhere between realization and regret. "You should have told us." "And what would have changed?" I asked. "You would have grieved sooner? Hated sooner?" I needed time to gather myself. Now you understand why. Sorrel didn't argue. She just left the door half open behind her. I walked to the window and looked out into the dark. Headlights passed slowly down our street, slowed near the house, then rolled on. I didn't need to see the car to know who it was. People who've done real damage don't knock. They circle. Later, I sat at my desk. I didn't need to read the prenup again. It was still lying face up from earlier, like a slap someone forgot to retract. I looked at it one more time, then whispered to the still air, "If you think you can burn down what I built, you better pack matches." Then I reached forward, turned off the desk lamp, and walked away. By Thursday afternoon, the weather had turned. That gentle chill that comes before a cold front, like the world warning you not to get too comfortable. I dressed in silence, black dress, long sleeves, nothing flashy. I wrapped my hair in a silk scarf, a gesture for myself, not him. I left early. The restaurant wasn't far, but I didn't want to arrive second. Not tonight. The hostess smiled when she saw me, led me to the corner table. The same one where we'd sat 17 years ago, the first time he told me he loved me. I remember what I wore that night too. A green sweater with a snag on the left cuff. He said I looked like I belonged in a painting. Tonight, I didn't want to be anyone's muse. I sat with my hands folded, eyes on the front entrance. Drayton walked in at exactly 7:35, dressed like he was on a board of something important. Navy blazer, tailored shirt, that expensive watch he only wore when he wanted to be noticed. He smiled like none of it had ever happened, like there hadn't been a cabin, or a woman, or a lawyer. "Just like old times," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. I smiled back. "Except I'm not the one pretending tonight." The server arrived. He ordered the same dish he always did. Ribeye, medium rare, glass of bourbon neat. I asked for a sparkling water, no wine, no indulgence. I didn't want even a second of blurred judgment. He talked. About the house. About some mutual friends I hadn't seen in years. About his business and how transitions are tough but necessary. Not once did he say my name. I nodded. Let him speak. Let him perform. He was always better on stage. When the server brought dessert menus, I waved mine away. "I'm good," I said, reaching into my clutch. I pulled out a manila envelope, slim, sealed. I slid it across the table. "That's yours," I said. "I suggest you read it alone." He opened it anyway. Inside was the last piece of the story. My final letter to him. Photocopies of the legal transfer of all trust holdings. A copy of the prenuptial agreement with Arlena. Yes, the one he tried to file quietly. Stills from the cabin footage. And a notarized letter confirming he would no longer inherit anything from me. Not the house, not the savings, not even the damn silverware his mother gave us. He didn't blink, not at first. He held the papers like they might catch fire in his hands. Then, quietly, he asked, "So this is it?" I tilted my head. "You tried to replace me before I was gone, so I decided to erase you before I leave." He set the folder down, folded his napkin, and tried to find words. I didn't wait for them. That's when the screen behind him lit up. The restaurant was celebrating its anniversary and had thrown together a slideshow of longtime patrons, families, couples, milestones. I recognized the music before the pictures even began. And there we were, the Bellmeyer family, Christmas 3 years ago, Merrick laughing near the tree, Sorrel in the kitchen helping Gilda frost cookies, Drayton pouring eggnog, clip after clip, smiles, firelight, laughter. But I wasn't in any of them, not one. Even when I had been there, behind the camera, cooking the food, wrapping the gifts, I was invisible. The woman at the next table leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Wasn't she part of that family?" I stood slowly, finished the last sip of my water, and placed my napkin on the plate. "Funny, right?" I said to no one in particular. "You deleted me from their stories. Now I've simply returned the favor." I turned. Didn't look back. Outside, the air was sharper than it had been when I arrived. My lawyer was waiting in the car, parked near the curb. I opened the door, slid into the passenger seat, and handed him a flash drive. "He might still fight," I said, "but I don't bleed for him anymore." We didn't say much on the ride home. As we pulled into the driveway, I looked back at the restaurant's lights disappearing behind the trees. "Let him go down with his silence," I said. We pulled into the driveway just past 9. The porch light was still on, humming softly, casting a weak halo over the doormat that hadn't seen a welcome in weeks. I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the car a moment longer, fingers resting on the edge of my clutch, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Inside, everything was still. Not quiet. Still. There's a difference. Quiet is something you expect. Stillness is what remains after all the movement has stopped. Over the next few days, I stayed mostly in the house. I didn't answer calls unless they were from Sorrel or Merrick. I didn't check social media, didn't scroll through old emails, didn't reread anything from Drayton. Not that he'd sent anything. One afternoon, I stood in my office and looked at the boxes I'd begun packing. Not for moving, just organizing. Every child gets one. Not a box of paper trails, but of meaning. Merrick's held my father's old watch, a first edition book he used to read on the porch with me when I was little, and a letter I wrote during chemo round 3. The one where I thought I wouldn't make it. Sorrel's held my recipe cards in my handwriting, the locket her grandmother gave me before she passed, and a photo of the 3 of us from her high school graduation. I'd written behind it, simply, I was always watching, even when I was quiet. And then there were the photo albums, each one lovingly assembled, each moment frozen, family holidays, camping trips, birthdays, and each of them missing one face. His. I didn't crop him out. I didn't blur his features. I simply selected the moments he wasn't in. Or when he was, I turned the page. I didn't explain why. Sometimes healing isn't found in what you preserve. It's in what you refuse to carry forward. 1 week after the dinner, I packed the boxes into Merrick's truck. He and Sorrel came by to help with the garden. I watched them move with practiced coordination, the way siblings do when they've lived through something shared and wordless. Later that afternoon, Sorrel sat beside me on the porch of the cabin, a quilt over her lap, flipping through her album. "Why'd you leave the gaps?" she asked, her voice low, not confrontational. I didn't turn toward her. I just watched the fog dance over the mountains. "Because some things aren't meant to be filled," I said. "They're meant to be remembered, as warnings." She didn't reply, but she nodded. That was enough. Drayton hadn't been seen much since, not at fundraisers, not at the golf club. His name had disappeared from the company site. Word was that investors started pulling out after a local magazine ran a piece about quiet divorce justice. It didn't name names, but anyone who knew, knew. He hadn't been arrested. There were no court dates, no splashy lawsuits, but silence can be louder than scandal. At events, people didn't greet him. They turned their heads, pretended to check their watches. He wasn't exiled. He just found himself standing alone. I never said his name again. Not to Merrick, not to Sorrel, not even in my thoughts. Not out of shame, just choice. His name had taken up enough space in my story. One late evening, as the wind shifted and brought in the scent of early summer, I walked the garden path behind the cabin. My steps were slower now. The treatments were wearing me thin, but not hollow. I sat on the bench I had placed beneath the old maple, one of the first we planted together, back when things felt like they might last forever. The plaque on the bench read, "She remembered everything and still chose peace." Merrick joined me a few minutes later. We didn't speak right away. We rarely needed to. After a while, he asked, "Do you ever regret staying silent for so long?" I looked up at the branches. They held the last few blossoms of spring, trembling but unbroken. "No," I said, because silence gave me space to rebuild, while they thought I was breaking. That night, after they left, and the house had settled into its nighttime hush, I lit a candle on the windowsill and opened my journal. I didn't write much, just a title for something I might finish someday. This isn't a story about betrayal. It's about what happens when you survive it with your soul intact. Before we close this story, I want to speak not just as Lana, but as someone who's walked through fire and came out not untouched, but unburnt in all the right places. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's a strategy. Sometimes it's the only space we have left to think, to breathe, to plan. And when the time is right, silence turns into a voice sharper than any scream. You don't always get the apology. You don't always get the justice you deserve. But you can still write the ending. You can still decide who gets to stay in your story and who doesn't. If you're watching this and you've been erased, overlooked, or quietly replaced, I hope you know this truth. Your worth isn't based on who recognizes it. It's based on the fact that you survived. And now, you get to rebuild. On your terms. Let me ask you this. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Have you ever walked away, not to escape, but to reclaim? If this story touched something in you, leave a comment below. Just drop a 1 if you've ever had to start over. Or tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. And if you didn't connect with it, that's okay too. Tell me why. Every story won't fit every heart. But if it did speak to yours, if it whispered something familiar, then I hope you'll stick around. We have more stories to tell. Ones that heal, ones that bite, ones that remind us we're not alone. So if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next time we sit down and talk like this. Quiet, honest, and soul to soul. Because sometimes the stories we tell are the ones that help us breathe again.